Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today is somebody really important. Kimberly Carter is a self-confidence coach, and you can find out more about Kimberly Carter and her wonderful work at kimberlycarter.live. Welcome, Kimberly Carter.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to be talking today about how racism affects your self-confidence. So before we talk about how racism affects a person's self-confidence, what exactly is self-confidence? How do we know when we have it? How do we know when we don't have it?
Well, I like to differentiate self-esteem from self-confidence. And I always say that self-esteem is more about how you feel about yourself, maybe even your appearance or on the outside. But your confidence is something that's coming from within, and it's more to do with your abilities than like per se your looks or how you feel about superficial things. And so yes, self-confidence definitely is about your abilities and your belief in yourself concerning your abilities.
Okay, now Kimberly Carter, how has systemic racism negatively impacted Black Americans?
Okay, so definitely we can start off by thinking of this current racist pandemic in terms of a home. A home is built and then it's passed down from one generation to the next. So now you may not have physically constructed the home. However, you've inherited this home and you now benefit from living inside of it. So at first, when you build a home, you build the foundation for it to stand on. And so America's home, if you will, and the foundation that it's laid on is all steeped in racism. The racism that came with enslaving Blacks and the racism that came with taking the land from the indigenous Indians who were already here. And so if your home has foundation issues, you do not ignore those issues. You definitely fix those issues, or else your whole entire home is in jeopardy of collapsing. And that's how I like to think about America's systemic racism issue. We need to address and we need to fix it because it's an old foundational issue, if you will. So we do have to start there, Catherine, and we have to understand that racism is definitely a set of institutional, cultural, and interpersonal patterns and practices that create advantages for people groups, and then the same time creates disadvantages for the group of people that's not included in that first group. And so in America, unfortunately, that just happens to be Blacks and indigenous people and white people as the dominant people group in this whole scenario.
Okay, now, so you grew up in the United States. Which state did you grow up in, Kimberly?
Now, I grew up in Alabama. I grew up, was born in Mobile, and I was raised in Birmingham.
Okay. And I grew up in Georgia, and no offense, but we were always like, thank God for Mississippi and Alabama. So you grew up in an area of the country, as I did, that's well known for its racism.
Yes.
So when you were growing up, how did the experiences that you had as a child affect your own self-confidence?
Well, unfortunately for me, I grew up, I will say, in a predominantly white school for my elementary and my formative years. And so I definitely did feel that separation from a dominant group, myself being Black and a dominant culture being white, if you will. And as far as my self-confidence, unfortunately, there are so many ways that your self-confidence gets damaged over the course of your life. And so as you can imagine, as a Black person or for Black Americans, receiving a constant negative message of inferiority as a foundation that you're supposed to be building your life on, it starts to kind of weigh that foundation down. It starts to take away from who you feel like you are. And so you're already starting to build on a very shaky foundation. And so to contrast that, white Americans are not having to build on a foundation of feeling like they're inferior or second-class citizens. So I definitely felt those both undertone and overtones of racism, as a child and as a teenager.
Now, you are a self-confidence coach. How does racism affect a person's self-confidence?
And so, like I was kind of saying, as you can imagine just from the gate, from the start, being told that you're not as good as this person because of the color of your skin, and then trying to take whatever it is that you're trying to achieve in your life and rise through that, if you will, or grow up through that. It definitely has a negative impact on your self-confidence, and it leaves you having to struggle and grapple with extra issues, if you will, that you wouldn't have had if racism had been eradicated or if it never had been presented to you as an issue.
Okay. Now, as a self-confidence coach, I'm sure that you have clients of all races and colors. Are there particular issues that you see your Black American clients facing that your Asian American clients or your white American clients are not facing?
Well, I definitely have seen that in comparison, that most of my Black clients have struggled with just speaking up, if you will, and finding their confident voice with which to voice whatever it is. Doesn't matter if it's work related or if it's personally at home. Their struggle always is right here, and it's stemming from feeling confident enough to speak up in an environment that has told you that you're inferior and that you don't have a right to speak up.
So if a person has faced racism their whole life, what you're saying is they're having trouble speaking up and speaking their truth and speaking their needs and wants, and that affects their self-confidence.
Yes.
Right. And just so you know, we're having some sound issues there. So I'm going to ask that again. So are there particular issues that Black Americans face regarding their self-confidence that people of other races may not be facing?
Yes, definitely. We're always going to be facing that extra layer of having to push through. And for my African American or Black clients, it's always manifesting in a voice, in an ability to speak up and out. And especially in an environment that has already programmed you and told you that you're inferior and that you don't have a right to speak your voice or to speak your truth. So definitely I see my Black clients struggling with voice more than anyone, or even the feeling that they have a right to voice, if that makes any sense.
Right. So your Black American clients who are struggling with self-confidence, how do you assist that person to find their voice so that they can speak their truth and speak their needs and wants?
Well, as a Black American, I always teach my Black clients to start with self-care and self-love, because that's been so lost on us as a group, just stemming from our history in America, where being enslaved and having to put the needs of another dominant race above your own, that was passed down generationally. And there have been studies about the DNA that's telling us that things really do get passed down. Emotional things, traits, trauma gets passed down from one generation to the next. And so I first start with them by teaching them, hey, you matter, and you need to start understanding that you need self-care. You have to indulge in yourself a little bit more than you've been told that you can. That's where I start.
Right. And, I found your comment about generations so interesting. In my work as a medical intuitive healer, I do a 7-generation healing. And let me kind of explain how it works. Because half of your DNA, 50% of your DNA comes from your mom, 50% comes from your dad. Then you go to your grandparents. 25% of your DNA comes from each of your 4 grandparents. Then you go to your great grandparents, it's 12.5%. You basically have to go back 7 generations to go to, I think, a little bit more than 1% of your DNA. So our DNA definitely affects our physical body and what we manifest as far as our health and what we look like and so on. But there's also there's genomes, which are genetic thought patterns, and these genetic thought patterns, again, they come back, and they are transferred through the generations. So it's not just what you're currently experiencing, it's what you learned and inherited from your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents, your great great grandparents, and so on, right?
Right. And to
So,
piggyback off of that, that made sense. And if you think of that in terms of the house that I was saying, it's all building the house that is you. And so all of these things reside inside you, inside of your house. And you have to deconstruct and then fix those foundational things that have been passed down generationally. Yes.
now, Kimberly Carter, self-confidence coach, you grew up in Alabama, which, as I said, like Georgia, where I grew up, is, one of the most racist part of the U.S. Although, if we look at what's happened, there's racist events happening, tragically in Minneapolis, New York City. However, historically, the South has been a troubled area. So what messages about self-confidence did you receive from your parents and your great grandparents? I don't know whether you knew your great grandparents, but what messages did you receive from your forebears about confidence?
Well, I can definitely speak to my parents. Now, I was adopted, and so I was raised and with parents that weren't genetically my own parents. However, my mother was a very big advocate of self-esteem, and she realized that I had a self-esteem deficit at an early age, and she got myself into like tapes about your self-esteem where I listened to them as I fell asleep at night. And she also did counseling, got us into counseling. And so I received very strong messages affirming who I was as a Black person and as a female. My mom and my father, they helped me, and they never stifled my voice. So they helped me to be able to speak up, maybe sometimes a little too much. And I would get told, like, you talk a little too much, but they never stifled my voice or told me that it was wrong for me to speak out and to speak up. And I would get in trouble in school and everything. Even in high school, I would get in a lot of trouble. My parents still never gave me the message that my voice didn't matter. So I had a very strong foundation of self-esteem and self-confidence coming up.
That's wonderful. Now, Kimberly Carter, from your perspective as a self-confidence coach, how does racism affect a person's overall mental, physical, and emotional health?
So again, going back to being constantly targeted for discrimination practices, this serves to keep Black people and other minority groups in a constant state of fear, which, as you know, as an intuitive healer, if you're in a state of fear, that lends itself to fight, flight, or freeze. I know it's a fourth one. I can't remember what it is.
That's exactly it. Fight, flight, or freeze. Survival mode.
Survival mode. And if you think about that for myself and then generationally, it's not just my own trauma and my own survival that's housed within me, but it's survival mode that's been passed down through my DNA. And so, as you can imagine, as a healer, I'm sure, if you're locked into fight or flight or freeze, your body isn't receiving oxygen like it should, because you're not relaxed enough to oxygenate your full body. Your muscles aren't relaxing. Your jaw is literally clenched, your shoulders. I started doing yoga in December with gentle and restorative yoga, and I've learned so much about how trauma is just locked into our muscles, and how trauma is keeping you from even just something as simple as being able to like stretch your hand fully above your head. And so, yeah, definitely the trauma and the racism that's in America and aimed at Black Americans has a horrible effect on every aspect of your health.
Now, I love that you mentioned that you started taking yoga. I've taught yoga for 25 years, and this is a great time for me to mention that during this time, a very stressful time, I am giving away my 9th book, The Little Book of Breath Work, for free. So the Little Book of Breath Work is breathing exercises, affirmations, and hand mudras that you can do anytime, anywhere to lower your stress level. And there's a little routine in there that I call 8 minutes to inner peace. And if you do that, you can usually cut your anxiety in half in about 8 minutes. So very, very powerful, and hand mudras that are very powerful. And I like to teach people as a healer things that you can do in the middle of the night when you can't call your confidence coach or me. It's like, okay, you're on your own here, but you can use your breathing, your hand mudras, and your affirmations.
I need that book.
Yeah, well,
resource.
all you have to do to get a free copy is to email Catherine at catherinecarrigan.com, and I will send you a free copy. Just ask for the Little Book of Breathwork, and I'll send you a copy, and definitely share it with everybody who needs it right now. I've given it away to people in 12 different countries.
Okay, great.
Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, people of color across the globe, both in the US and the UK, are disproportionately affected by the virus, both in terms of getting sick and dying. And experts argue there are many reasons for this, including a higher incidence of diabetes and heart disease. In your perspective as a self-confidence coach, how does racism affect a person's immune system?
Well, I started looking into this, especially because COVID-19 is attacking your upper respiratory system. And so the lungs are connected to the ability to be able to fully take in life, or if you will, fully to breathe. And so problems in the lungs are connected to feelings of unworthiness and not being worthy enough to live. And so if you take that messaging of racism that has been aimed at Black Americans and other minority groups for over 400 years, that tries to tell them that they're not worthy and full citizens and humans, and then you mix that with a pandemic, COVID-19, that's attacking your lungs, and it was a recipe for disaster. Further, racism is a threat to the safety of Black Americans. So now, like we were saying, you're locked into that fight, or freeze mode. And so all of these things at once are just a disaster waiting to just kill and take someone out. It's just layers and layers of things. And it's just so unfortunate, just even talking about it is making me have anxiety to a degree.
Right. And it's not lost on me, Kimberly Carter, that George Floyd's last words were, "I can't breathe."
Yes. I was just about to say it. I had to take a deep breath before I could even talk about that. When we saw him get lynched, because that's a modern day lynching that we witnessed, it was just the culmination of a clear picture about the intersections of racism meets this pandemic of COVID-19, and how racism is literally choking Black Americans. It's choking minority groups. It's literally causing us to not be able to fully breathe. It is killing us. And I feel like the eruptions that we're seeing is because that message resonated so deeply, not just with minority groups, but with resonated around the world with people that don't live in America. Because at once, for one time in history, we can all relate to the feeling of not being able to breathe because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so it's just been so much, Catherine. It really has. And it's just a picture, a very clear picture of the issues and the problems that need to be solved in America.
Right. And, the autopsy showed that George Floyd, at the time that the police officer's knee was on his neck, did indeed have coronavirus. That wasn't what killed him. He was killed by asphyxiation. But again, we have this virus that's affecting our ability to breathe. And then, we have this gentleman who was killed by a police officer and asphyxiated. So again, breathing is such a huge subject. And I really appreciate that you talked about the meaning of the lungs, because in my work as a medical intuitive, we talk about the emotions behind every organ in your body. And the lungs are about self-esteem and self-worth. And when you have good self-esteem, you breathe better. As you say, you take in life. And the negative aspects of lung meridian are stuck in depression. So,
Yeah.
right, stuck in depression. Now, how does racism affect a person's stress levels, Kimberly Carter?
Well, definitely, again, stating that if you're in a minority group in America, so for Black Americans, just being targeted, if you will, going to the store, an event such as going to the store, where I'm just in the store and I'm shopping, but I'm targeted as a Black American because someone thinks less of me, and so they're following me around the store. That causes stress. As a Black American, if you're a runner, we saw the gentleman get gunned down just because he was running. And running is something my husband does. And so after that incident aired, not only was he affected, I'm his spouse, I'm at home, and now I'm in a constant state of anxiety about something as simple as my husband wanting to just run around the block or, get his run time in. And so, yeah, it definitely keeps you on high alert, if you will, your stress levels, which of course goes back to not being able to fully relax, which of course goes back to not being able to fully breathe. And so I definitely am thankful that I found yoga, gentle and restorative yoga. But for so many people who haven't, and so many Black Americans and minority groups, it's just stressful without an outlet or without a way to work that stress out. And it just compounds in the body. It's definitely horrible.
Yes. And there's been studies about how Americans feel right now. And over the past 2 months, studies show that 30% of US adults have clinical levels of anxiety and depression. So this is something that's really affecting everyone for sure. And as you mentioned, we all need to find healthy outlets to release that stress, such as breathing exercises, such as practicing yoga, right?
Yeah, sure, definitely.
Now, Kimberly Carter, you are a self-confidence coach. And as I said, I know that you work with people of all races. Given your years of experience, would you say that self-confidence is a bigger issue for Black Americans than it is for Asian Americans or white Americans or people of other races?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Or Mexican Americans, right?
I would say that it's a more layered issue. I think that it's bigger in that it adds a different layer of racism. I think that other minority groups definitely do experience this unfair, and especially like American indigenous, but I guess it's manifested and it's targeted different. And so it's showing up different as far as self-confidence issues are concerned, if that makes any sense. And so I know everyone's getting into like the debates between Black lives and all lives. But right now, what we're addressing is something that this country was literally built on. And that's the lessening of Black Americans as actual citizens. And so, yes, I would say it definitely affects in a different way, a more targeted way, Black Americans.
So in your view, then self-confidence is a bigger challenge for Black Americans than it is for Americans of other races?
It can be, and especially, I'm not sure how to phrase this. And it all depends too on like your parents and like what they had access to. And we know having access can change an individual. But if you're just looking at a whole people group and we're just taking just like a view, if you will, of everyone, then yes, it is disproportionately affecting our self-confidence and our self-esteem.
Okay. So if you have a Black American or a Black American who's listening to this broadcast, what are some of the suggestions that you have for how they could rebuild or build their self-confidence, maybe for the first time?
I would definitely say and start off with just guarding your heart and what you hear. And I know right now, this is a time that we're all tuned into the media 24/7. We're tuned into all social media aspects. We have the TV looping the news 24/7. But it's very important what you're like allowing into your ears and your heart, because that's shaping how you see yourself. And so we're using this outlet right now, you and I, for a positive message to get out there into the world. However, all of the messages out there are not positive. I would say definitely guard what you're hearing right now, and take some time every day to just step away from all media so that you can kind of replenish. I always teach my clients to do words of affirmation where they set like a timer on their phone and it reminds them to stop, take a breath, and speak something positive. I would say turn off, everything, and turn on your own self, your own words of affirmation, and speak those over yourself. Start with that, definitely.
Great advice. Now, Kimberly Carter, many white people have faced criticism for proclaiming, "I am not a racist." How can white people in America and white people all over the world work with Black people to eradicate racism so that people of all colors can live and work together peacefully?
So I would say the first step for white Americans is to become educated. If this hasn't been something that has personally affected you, you may not fully understand it when a Black American or another minority say that they've experienced some sort of racist, undertone or overtone or comment being lodged at them. And so I would like to say the work has been done. You have social justice advocates, authors, trainers. And if you Google these topics, you definitely can come across books, recordings, it's TED Talks. It's just all sorts of ways to start educating yourself on this issue so that you can stop taking offense to like someone you may know, and you can maybe receive that from someone that you don't know who's an expert on a topic, who's done that work. And then again, I just want to say that you have to understand that America is a house of sorts. And when you build a home on a foundation, it is there unless you decide to take that foundation up. That foundation is there. So not ignoring the history of what our country was built on and how it started and how the country itself has become so prosperous, understanding that it was definitely systemic racism and practices that built this country, not being offended by that, but just facing that. And then take the time to listen to those who have personally experienced this racism. sometimes you're not supposed to offer a suggestion or argue. Sometimes just take in what the other person is saying. And that's not just true for the topic of racism. If I hurt my spouse in any kind of way, when he comes to me, I've learned I need to just listen to what he's saying without being offended, without offering an explanation or rebuttal. And a lot of times that serves to start the healing process. And so definitely just having empathy to listen to what someone is telling you about their own personal experience.
Now, Kimberly Carter, you grew up in Alabama, and this is a personal question that you may not feel comfortable answering, but did you experience instances of racism growing up that affected your self-confidence negatively?
My parents were very protective. So I had a few incidences. I remember being a teenager at a fair, and it was one of those fairs that sits in like a parking lot. It comes up for the fall and the spring. And I was there with one of my classmates, and we were waiting to get on a ride, and somebody spit on us. And when we turned around, it was the white man. He was the only person that was there, and he was just waiting for a line to form. And we looked back, and my classmate, he just took my shoulders and he walked me away. And later, I remember telling my father about the incident, and he was like, I'm sorry that happened. That was racism. And no adults were around to protect us. So my classmate, he knew what it was, because as Black Americans, our parents, they have talks with us from the time we're small to teach us how to handle these incidences so that we walk away with our lives. And so that's one that when all of these things started surfacing, that came back to my mind. I haven't thought about it in years, but that did come up for me. And that was very traumatizing for me. And it just showed a lot of hatred.
Now, if someone is listening to this broadcast and they're remembering their own incidents where they experienced racism, what are some of your suggestions about how they can go about healing that memory in themselves?
Well, it's going to be different for everyone. So much plays into this. Personality type plays into it, your upbringing, and your level of comfort with really delving into the past or even facing that. But I would say start with maybe vocalizing it to someone close to you that you can talk to, because some incidences we've never told anyone about. And that doesn't mean they didn't happen. That means that at the time when they occurred, we were so traumatized that we may not have had the words, to put into like, hey, this happened to me, and I feel like that's true, not just for what we're discussing, but that's true anyway. And so when something like that happens, so much shame comes over a person that there may not be room or understanding enough for them to vocalize it. So definitely vocalize it. Or I always encourage people to journal. If you need to journal that incident, just get it out there. Get out that this happened to me and I felt all kind of ways, spitting, angry, mad, unprotected, whatever you felt. Definitely just get that out though.
Right. And I like what you were saying, Kimberly Carter, at the beginning of the show, because we talked about the difference between self-esteem and self-confidence. And you said that self-confidence comes from within. So it has to do with your own opinion about yourself and your own opinion about your abilities.
Definitely.
So, and some of these very hurtful incidents of racism can go so deep. In my 10th book, Reading the Soul, I talk about soul wounds. And another thing that I talk about in Reading the Soul, again, as a soul, you may have had multiple lifetimes where you lived as a body. And, one of these things that millions of people, hundreds of millions of people experienced throughout history is slavery, right? And you may be living out the karma of slavery, which may show up in, working for nothing, for a long period of time. And as you say, not valuing your own life, not valuing yourself. So if a person who's listening to this broadcast recognizes that they do have low self-confidence and they have experienced racism throughout their life, what are some positive steps that that person can take to learn to value themselves and to learn to really realize that they're important, that their life matters, that who they are affects everyone around them?
Well, after journaling and after speaking about it, the next step I would suggest is getting a confidence coach. I'm a confidence coach. There are other people out there that are coaches and that can help you start to walk through, feelings of low self-worth, low self-confidence. And so if you have to go that route, definitely coaches help in so many different areas. And just by starting to fix those cracks in the foundation of your self-confidence, you can start to see yourself successful in so many different areas in your life. So I definitely would say get a coach, a life coach that can help you walk through those processes, because you don't have to do this hard work by yourself.
Right. Now, Kimberly Carter, what are the difficult discussions that we as a society need to have around the topic of healing racism?
Well, we need to begin with allowing ourselves to face the truth of what has shaped the United States. I heard the comedian Trevor Noah, he was talking about being a South African and how to him it is so strange when he came to America, how we won't talk about race, racism, or anything that has affected everyone, versus he's from South Africa and everyone has freely spoken about it. You're able to say these things occurred. So definitely start off, I think, as Americans starting off, we need to acknowledge openly amongst each other, to ourselves, what really took place in the history and the shaping of our country. Also, you have to be clear that acknowledging that these things happen is just the first step. It doesn't solve all the problems caused by the systemic racism, and it doesn't solve it all, but it's a step in the right direction of solving these issues for us. And so just facing the truth about the detrimental effects of colonialism on Indigenous Americans, on Black Americans, and even on white Americans who inflicted it, because you have, as the recipient, Black Americans have a certain amount of hurt and shame. And as the people who inflicted it, there's a certain amount of hurt and shame there as well. It's a book, My Grandmother's Hands, I think that's the title of it, where it's a lot to do with just the trauma, generational trauma, and the trauma that's passed down. But it's not just speaking about trauma on one side. The trauma has to be acknowledged on both sides.
Right. Now, Kimberly Carter, if there was just one thing that you think could be done to change people's attitudes about people who are different from them, right? Because we're really talking about, what we perceive as the other, people who are different from us, perhaps growing up in different cultures with different backgrounds. What would it be?
I would say that we should start with doing unto others what we want done to us. I think it's important that if we all just treated each other with the dignity and the respect that we know we should have, I feel like that a lot of the issues we're experiencing would cease to exist. And for true social justice to be served, there has to be more than just an understanding and an acknowledgement. We have to do the actual work of correcting some of these injustices, which is known as retribution. I feel like starting with treating others like we want to be treated, and being willing to face and do this work, we can dismantle these issues, and we can, as I was saying earlier about the home, we can start to fix those cracks in the foundation of our home, and the home in this instance just being America.
very interesting. And I always feel that the most selfish thing that I could do is to be kind, generous, and thoughtful to everyone. Because whatever you put out is what you experience back, right? That's the law of karma. And the law of karma is like the law of gravity. I don't have to know that gravity exists. I don't even have to understand gravity. It just works.
Yeah.
And so when you put out kindness and thoughtfulness, that's what you tend to receive back, right?
Right.
Yeah. So again, we're talking about how racism affects your self-confidence. And you said that that it's just a much more complicated issue for Black Americans, right? And what are some of the commonalities? What are, because anyone can have issues with confidence, right? We can all find ways where we feel like we're not good enough or don't have enough or aren't enough. What are some of the common denominators in lack of self-confidence for people of all races?
Well, definitely some common denominators will be just how you show up in the world, or how you choose not to show up, if you will. So just the fear of speaking up can affect everyone, but it could disproportionately affect Black Americans, because Black Americans are targeted because of their skin color versus someone else who's not targeted for the same issue. Or maybe, say, a Mexican American may be targeted because of their ethnicity or the color of their skin. However, what's happening with Black Americans is that the issue is going back longer and further for us in America as Americans. And so also other things is just the lack of advocating for oneself is very common amongst people who have low self-confidence issues. And so their inability to just say what hurts, or to just say, hey, I want a chance, or to just show up and to just say what it is that they need or want. So I definitely think that affects everyone, people that I've coached and that I've come into contact with.
So by getting in touch with what we want and what we need, is that a helpful way of being able to begin to express what we want and we need?
It definitely is. And like I said earlier, you may need a coach to help you start to identify this and walk through the steps of unraveling all of the damage that's been done to you, all of the ways in which you're not showing up, or the things that you want to do, but you're afraid to do. So definitely you may need that professional help to unravel just the many layers and to rebuild yourself in a better way, and to advocate for yourself, show up for yourself, and be the person that you want to be.
Okay. Now, since we're talking about racism and self-confidence, are there ways or areas that you feel that Black Americans have maybe more self-confidence than people of other races?
Well, I feel like there have been like so many current movements that are helping us to walk in just the pride of who we are, just as Black Americans. And so I will say that if you do suffer from feeling alienated or feeling less than, there are so many movements. And you can Google some of these. You have, just plethora of things going on in the world today, and you can find your tribe. You can find people that are helping you to build up who you are, so that you will have a self-esteem boost, a healthier self-confidence, and that you'll be able to show up better.
Right. And you said that the common thing that you find for Black Americans is trouble finding their voice.
Yes.
So, and there's ways to find your voice, as you mentioned: journaling, singing, public speaking. Are there other ways, in addition to journaling, public speaking, singing, that people can find their voice?
Well, simply just showing up and speaking as well, because finding your voice is also about identifying it and then using it. And so finding those small ways that you can begin to just speak up and speak out. And, finding your voice isn't necessarily about being loud, but it's just about speaking up. And so, starting to practice that. If it's just to the person, just to a friend, just practicing it and just starting to manifest that in that way is very, very important.
Okay. Kimberly Carter, self-confidence coach. Any final thoughts for our audience about racism and self-confidence?
I just would like to say, understand if something hasn't happened to you personally, it doesn't nullify it. It doesn't mean that it's not happening to the next person. And so I think definitely we all at this time, and it's a very crucial time in history, we need to just practice empathy, listening, and self-educating ourselves in the area of racism, systemic racism, social injustices, and how that may be playing out for the next person, even if it's not personally affecting us. And definitely, like I said, guard what you're hearing and guard what you're allowing to constantly loop in your mind pertaining to who you are. Definitely be careful with these things during this time.
You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. Definitely sign up for my newsletter when you visit my website so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Our guest today, Kimberly Carter, self-confidence coach. Find out about her work at kimberlycarter.live. And remember, take the time to speak up for yourself and find how much you matter and your life matters. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.